Welcome back to Learning Docker. Now in today's tutorial we're going to be looking at advanced networking with PHP and MySQL. This is a follow-in from our previous tutorial where we were looking at basic networking within Docker. This is a video that a few people have requested in the comment boxes down below, so if you do want to see a video from me focusing on a specific topic, feel free to leave a comment and I might make it as one of my tutorials. Okay, so let's just jump into things. Now, what are we going to create? Our network will consist of the following: 2 bridge networks, 1 MySQL container, and 1 Apache and PHP container. Okay, so let's have a look at this in a diagram. So we have our 2 networks, our front-end network and our back-end network. And then on top of this, we're going to need some containers. Now, the first thing you're going to notice that both front-end and back-end network have a gateway. Any network bridge that you create within Docker will automatically have a gateway assigned to it. You can specify where this gateway will be, but by default it's usually the first IP of the range that's assigned to the network. Okay, so in our front end we have our gateway and we also have our PHP and Apache container, and in the back end we have our gateway and our MySQL container. So if you cast your mind back to our last tutorial when we talked about containers communicating across networks, theoretically yes, it is possible with a lot of let's just say jiggery pokery, but it's not an easy practice and therefore the communication across networks can be difficult. Or on a basic configuration, it's essentially not possible. So how do we get around this? Again, you'll have to remember back from the last tutorial where I covered briefly on how you could get around this being creative with your container placements. And what I mean by that is instead of having the PHP and Apache container just exclusively sitting in the front end, it could sit in both of the networks. So it can sit in the front end and the back end because a container can be attached to multiple networks. Okay, so now that it's sitting in the front end and the back end, it can actually happily communicate with the MySQL container. So fantastic. But let's have a look at this in a real world scenario, or more specifically, let's just see it in code. Okay, so I've got my folder tutorial 7, which you're probably used to by now. Obviously, when this video goes out, all the code will be available on GitHub if you're interested. Let's also clear my, I don't know what's up with my terminal. Let's create a new terminal. Oh, I've still left everything up from the previous run. Let's just get rid of that. Okay, so what are we going to need first? Now, the first thing is we're going to have to define some containers. So let's get our containers defined. Unlike our previous tutorials, we're going to need multiple Docker files. So we're going to need 1 Docker file for MySQL and 1 Docker file for PHP. Theoretically, you don't have to, but I'm going to start getting people used to doing that sort of setup. So let's create a new folder, and because it's MySQL, we're going to have one folder called database, and we're going to have another folder called, let's just call it web, because that's our front end container, should we say. So now that we have our 2 containers set up, or our 2 environments set up, we're also going to need some Docker files in there. So Docker file, and we're going to need another file called Docker file. So in our first Docker file for our database, we're simply just going to need from MySQL. Now I'm going to specify a version for this because I want to keep up to date with the latest versions. I'm going to use 8.0. Now there is a couple of challenges with using, with using 8.0, but I'll go into that when I get into the configuration a little bit more. So that's our Docker file for our database. Let's just jump into our web, and we're going to need from PHP, and we're going to use the tag 7.2-Apache as we've also previously used. Now, if you cast your mind back a little bit to our creating customized containers or customized images, we're going to need a couple of extensions. So we're going to need to run. Now, something I used differently before, I was using Peckle to install extensions. I probably should have used the standard Docker PHP extension install mechanism that is in place, seeing as I use the Docker PHP extension enable. So I'm going to use that in today's tutorial and just use docker-php-extension-install. And for this tutorial, I'm going to need MySQL and I also want to enable that. So same thing again, Docker PHP extension enable and MySQL. Okay, So I'm also just going to throw on top of this xdebug as well. So rather than just typing all that out again, let's just copy paste and change that xdebug. And a bit of jiggery-pokery, and there we go. Okay, so we have our web container set up, or a web doc file set up, as well as our database doc file set up. Okay, so the next step for us would be to create our DockerCompose file. So let's create a new file called DockerCompose.yml.yaml, and let's start building our DockerCompose file. Now we're going to use version 3 for this. I want to point out that there's actually a problem when doing networking in version 3. It's to do with assignment of the gateway IP, but I wouldn't really address that in too much of this tutorial. I think it's going to be fixed in later versions of DockerCompose 3. I have actually checked that there is an official bug on the bug list for the issue, so just so you are aware. If you do want to specify your own gateway IP, you will need to go back to DockerCompose version 2. Okay, but that's enough of that. So now we've defined our Docker version, we need to state that we're going to, instead of services as we've typically done in the past, we need to define networks. So we're going to create a network, and our first network is going to be toot 07-front end. Now I'm calling these by the tutorial name as well, because I've noticed I'm creating a lot of Docker containers as part of these tutorials, and we're going to start having conflicting container names, conflicting networks, conflicting volumes, and so forth. So I'm going to try and make them unique to the tutorials they're on. And for this one, if you remember the previous tutorial, we also talked about drivers. In this case, we're going to use the default driver, which is the bridge network. Then we're going to do something known as IPAM. Now, if you're curious what IPAM is, it's IP address management. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to set up a couple of subnets. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is define a driver for an IPAM, and we're just going to use the default one for now. Then we're going to need to configure our subnet by simply stating -subnet : and we're going to choose an IP range, so 172.10.1.0/24. If you know anything about subnet masks, that is 256 addresses. So this will be from the IP range 127.10.1.0 to 127.10.1.255. Okay, so that's going to be our first network. Now our second network is going to be toot 07-backend. Same sort of thing really. The only difference is going to be, if I can spell this right, it's going to be our subnet. So it's going to be a driver, it's going to be bridge. If I can spell right today, I can't even type. IPAM is going to use a driver, a default, and a config of subnet 172.10.2.0, and this time we're going to use a subnet mask of 23, giving us 512 addresses. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I actually want two ranges. So I want 172.10.2 and I also want 172.10.3. So subnet mask of 215 gives me both those ranges in completeness, and I'll come onto that a little bit more when I start defining the containers. So now we've defined and structured our network, we now need to define our containers. But before that, I want to jump into something else which I forgot when I was last trying to record this video, is our environment file. Now, as part of DockerCompose, you can specify environment variables, or you can simplify it by creating a specific environment file. So I can simply say, for this case, it's development.env. And now we have an environment file. Our environment file is going to contain several things. Now, this is all things specific to the MySQL container. So we need a MySQL user, and we're simply going to state it's called sysadmin. MySQL password for our sysadmin is just going to be syspassword, and then finally MySQL root password. Now you always have to define a root password, so in this case it's just going to be root password. Now my advice to you, Do not ever use this environment file, and this was the reason I wanted an environment file over having it defined within the DockerCompose file. Now you can, like I said, define environment variables, but if you wanted a development environment and a production environment or a staging environment, you would want completely separate environment files as not part of your DockerCompose. You potentially want something that can be controlled by your continuous integration tool, or something like Jenkins or GitLabs or Concourse or Bamboo or whatever. You basically don't want it part of your development or CI structure. So let's now create our containers. So let's first define services, and within our services we are going to need our first service, which is going to be toot07-db, which is going to be our database service. And in there we're going to have a build which is going to reference the db Docker file, so simply .db, which is the reference to the folder. Then we're going to issue a fix for MySQL 8.2. Now this took a bit of trial and error to get this right, so we're going to issue a command to it, and we're going to issue the command default authentication plugin equals MySQL native password. Now the reason that we're doing this is because I'm using MySQL 8. MySQL 8 uses SHA encryption for the passwords, and therefore the encryption technique for a standard MySQL connection will not work. But I'm not going to go into that in today's tutorial. It's a bit more in depth with MySQL MySQL client config setups. But I'm just going to make things easy for myself and just use that. Also, if you look on the Docker Hub for MySQL, it does also state to use that, which is where I actually found the solution for it. So in our ports now, we're just simply going to map 3306 of our local machine to 3306 of our Docker container. Now I shouldn't actually need this, so it's okay for now, but if you're doing any development, you probably want the port exposed locally. If you do have a MySQL instance running locally, make sure to change this to something that won't conflict with your local instance, something like maybe 3308 or 3307 or whatever. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is define our network setup. Now because this is only ever going to exist in our backend network, that's all we simply need to define. So network is going to be toot07-backend. And that's pretty much it. But we're also going to define our IP within the backend as well. And our IP is simply going to be stated IP v4_address, and then our address 172.10.3, because remember this IP range covers 172.10.2 as well as 172.10.3. .2. Now the reason I'm choosing .2 is, like I stated before with the gateways usually sit at .1. Now with this subnet setup, it actually is going to default to 172.10.2.1, and technically 172.10.3.1 will actually be free, but I just want to be consistent with all the other IPs that I'm going to be using, so I'm going to just use 2 for now. And that is pretty much it for the IP address setup. Finally, the last thing is to define our environment file, which is simply going to be .db/development.env. Now, like I said previously before, you could define environment variables by just simply stating, I think it's environment, and then the key pair values, such as, I'm not sure if this needs to be an array or not, but it's something like MySQL equals 123. And I think it actually has to be in. Does it need to be like that? No, I think it is just the standard like that. Either way, if you want to know a bit more about the MySQL, the actual environments, feel free to check out the documentation. I think I do leave a link in the README for that. So we've defined our environment file, and that is basically our database container setup. Finally, we need to set up our front end or our web container service. So let's set up toot07-web. In fact, I'm going to call it www just to make things a little easier. And I'm also going to rename that to www just to make things a little bit more consistent. This time we're going to build the folder ./www. We're not going to need to issue any commands because this is our own configuration. We're going to be mapping ports. I think we'll use 8080 this time to port 80 on our container, and we're going to be using this time multiple networks. So our networks will be toot 07-backend, as well as, make sure we use that right, toot 07-front-end. Okay, so we also need to map a couple of IP addresses here. IPv4 address is going to be for the backend 172.10.2.2, as so we don't conflict with the gateway, and also the same thing with the front end. IP address 172.10.1.2. So that's all our networks have. Because we're going to be relying on this container, we need just to make sure that we depend on the first container actually working for us to actually require the second container. Toot 07-db. Okie dokie. So we've now set up all of our Docker containers and environments and so forth. In fact, I have forgotten one thing, that our web container does not have a volume. So let's create a volume, and let's just simply map, similar to before, /source to var www.html. Okay, but we need a source folder. Call that source. And let's throw in a PHP file, so index.php. Now we're going to need a little script to test this. So let's create some PHP. Let's create a MySQL connection, which is going to be a new MySQL. Now, this is where the environment variables come handy. So we have a host, which is actually something we can reference because, like I mentioned in the previous tutorial with networking, the bridge network in Docker allows us to automatically resolve DNS names. And when you actually create a Docker container, and in this case it will be created with toot07db as a name, it will also create as a host and therefore is resolvable. The next thing we're going to do is use the database password. Now in theory we could have the same environment variable set here as we have over in the other container, which I'm actually tempted to do. I might move that up to the main environment. Yes, I'm actually going to change this. I never actually planned to do this as the previous tutorial. I'm going to change that to .env, and I'm also going to make that environment file available to the www container too. And hopefully, if I call a get env, and then I can simply state MySQL user, and then get env MySQL password, and then simply for the database that we're going to use in this case, I'm just going to use the information schema. So just that we have a default database connection. So this allows us to not actually have to hard code usernames and passwords inside our code either, which is fantastic. It's another great step forward. Let's just make sure that I've not cocked anything up with that. So we put that file in there, files in there, sitting currently in there, and that should all be good. So the next thing we can do is if MySQL connection error or connect error, so checking to see if the connect error exists, we're going to say, let's just kill it, or echo connection error, and then let's just dump the connection error itself. So I think that should be connect error. Yeah, let's just should we check the number as well? Yeah, let's check the number. So MySQL connect error? No, I think it is for error number. And then simply the actual connection error itself. Else, let's just simply say echo MySQL I connected successfully. Okay, so there's our script set up. Hopefully I haven't missed anything there. We have our container set up. We have our network set up, our Docker file set up. I think I might actually have DockerCompose PS. I think I might have containers already set up. Why is this invalid? Network contains null, which is an invalid type. Subnet. Why is this an invalid type? IP address. Shouldn't have been an array. No, should that have been an array? Some networks are defined but not used by any service. Toot front end service www uses undefined network. Toot 08 front end. Correct. We have two containers up, so if I Docker Compose down, hopefully it will remove all of those. I do Docker Compose, yes. Hopefully they should all be destroyed. Now if I do Docker Compose up, it might let me create all my Docker containers. Right, so it's built the bridge. I'll build both the bridges. It's now created both the Docker 1, tutorial DB and the tutorial www. Now I have actually run this before, so it already created them. It's currently in the process of spinning up MySQL. Our localhost IP address should be sitting on port 8080. Now it's finished running. The last thing you'll probably see is plugin ready for connection, socket blah 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 blah, bind address means the local address with no limitations on port 33060. Ignore that because it is actually running on port 3306. And we should, if I am right, be able to access localhost 8080. Fingers crossed. MySQL connected successfully. Fantastic. So we have our entire Docker container environment running and working. We've got two networks. We've got two containers running on the network, on the separate networks. Well, one's running on the separate network. Let's just have a look at this in a sort of diagram form. So we have gateway 1, which is front end, which is going to be sitting on the IP range 172.10.1.0 172.10.1.255. It has a gateway on 172.10.1.1, and it also has a PHP and Apache container sitting on 172.10.1.2. So that's going to be that container all set up and working on that network. And on our second backend network, we have the IP range 172.10.2.0 running through to 172.10.3.255. On that network, we have a gateway sitting on 172.10.2.1 with a PHP and Apache instance sitting on 172.10.2.2 and a MySQL instance sitting on 172.10.3.2. Now, I hope that was useful to you. All the config and so forth is going to be uploaded, and you should be able to play with it and so forth quite easily. If you have any problems deploying it, don't forget to do your Docker Compose down, or go in and destroy or delete any existing images, containers, volumes, and networks which might cause a conflict with your tweaking. Please refer to my other videos for how to do that. If you found this tutorial useful, give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in the content I will be producing, please hit the subscribe button and you'll be notified every time I release a video. And other than that, that is pretty much it for our tutorial today. I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to cover next with Docker. I might look at doing things a little bit more advanced with networking. I might look at other alternative means for using sort of Docker networks. I'm still playing around with my next tutorial. I might throw in some other things like Mongo, Redis, Java, and so forth, just to look at how to containerize those types of environments. I'm also quite tempted to do Kubernetes. I'm still on the fence whether I want to tackle the Kubernetes as part of a whole series of tutorials or make it as part of the Learn Docker tutorials, but for now I'm just going to call it there. Now, I hope you found this useful. I hope I didn't make it too complicated. All source code and everything should be available on the GitHub. Any necessary links will be displayed in the description box down below, so please check them out. But until next time, I'm going to see you around.